The lonely mile marker, 245 stop. Truckers call it the lonely stop, mile marker 245, buried deep in the heart of the New Mexico desert. For those who drive the long highways across the Southwest, it's a whispered legend. Some joke about it, others refuse to talk. One thing is certain, nobody stops there willingly. It's not just a rest area, it's a place where trucks break down one after another. Roy was a seasoned trucker, 15 years on the road, and he'd heard the stories. They didn't scare him. Hell, they didn't even register. Until the night his rig sputtered to a stop right at mile marker 245. It was supposed to be a routine run, machinery parts bound for Phoenix. The engine had purred like a kitten up until it coughed and died. Roy coasted to the shoulder, muttering curses under his breath, and flicked on his hazards. He checked the fuel gauge, but it flickered like a busted neon sign, flashing between full and empty. He frowned, stepping out of the cab, gravel crunching under his boots as he took in the empty desert. The moon hung low, casting long, eerie shadows across the endless stretch of scrubland. The air was cold, biting for a desert night, and something about the silence made the hair on Roy's arms stand up. He popped the fuel cap and took a sniff. A strange chemical tang filled his nostrils. Something wasn't right. As he crouched by the truck, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly growing brighter. Roy stood up, waving down the truck. It slowed, pulling up behind him, and an older man climbed out. Face weathered like sun-bleached leather, a name patch on his jacket reading Stan. "Engine trouble?" Stan asked, his voice a rasp like he'd swallowed too much desert sand. "Something's up with the fuel," Roy replied, his eyes scanning the road behind them. "You ever hear of anything weird going on around here?" Stan's expression darkened as his gaze drifted toward the mile marker. "You ain't the first. Some folks say the place is cursed. Others think someone's messing with the trucks. Either way, no one sticks around long. Not if they know what's good for them." Roy felt a knot form in his gut. "Cursed?" Stan's Z's stayed fixed on the marker as he spoke. "Strange things happen around here. Some trucks disappear. Some drivers never make it back." Roy managed to get his truck back on the road after Stan helped him siphon the tainted fuel into the desert. They worked in silence, and despite Stan's calm demeanor, Roy could tell the man was rattled. When they parted ways, Stan left him with a warning. "If you ever see him, those figures creeping around, just go. Don't stick around to find out what they want." Roy didn't sleep much that night, his mind racing. He began asking other truckers about mile marker 245, collecting stories like puzzle pieces. The more he heard, the darker the picture became. Truckers spoke of strange figures lurking by the roadside, whispers in the dark, and headlights that followed them, only to vanish when they checked their mirrors. The stories weren't just rumors anymore. They were real, and they all led back to a small gas station about 50 miles from the marker. Every truck that had broken down at mile marker 245 had refueled at the same place. Roy did some digging, called a few contacts, even spoke to the sheriff in the nearest town. The sheriff's words stayed with him long after the call ended. "There's a local gang that's been running a scam for years, tampering with fuel, sabotaging engines. But we've also found old trucks out in the desert. Abandoned, stripped clean. No bodies, just empty rigs rusting under the sun." Roy couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was happening out there. Something that went beyond a simple scam. A week later, he arranged a meeting at a diner off the interstate with Maria, a tough-as-nails trucker who had her own encounter at mile marker 245. Maria was no nonsense, all sharp edges and tired eyes. She took a long drag from her cigarette before she spoke, her voice low. "It was about 2 months ago. I'd heard the stories, but I thought it was just trucker talk, you know? I stopped to rest at 245. Figured I could push through to Albuquerque after a quick nap." She glanced around the diner, her eyes flicking to the windows, as if she expected to see someone watching. "Around midnight, I woke up to footsteps. thought maybe it was an animal at first, but then I heard voices, low, whispering. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the cab, and saw 3 figures by my truck. They were messing with the fuel tank. Roy leaned in, his pulse quickening. "What did you do?" I yelled. They didn't run, just stared at me like they were waiting for something. I thought I was done for. One of them threw something at me before they took off. A rock, maybe, left a scar. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a jagged mark on her forearm. Roy's mind raced. He had heard stories of people tampering with fuel, but no one had ever gotten this close to catching them. And the way Maria described it, their calmness, made it all the more unsettling. "I reported it to the sheriff," she said, "but nothing came of it, just like the others." Roy and Maria sat in silence for a while, the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes filling the space around them. There was something about mile marker 245 that wasn't just about sabotage trucks. It was about fear and control. A week later, Roy found himself driving back toward mile marker 245, accompanied by Carl, an old friend who used to work in law enforcement. Carl was good at digging up things that others wanted to stay buried, and Roy needed answers. As they neared the marker, Roy spotted something new, a barely visible trail leading into the desert. His pulse quickened. He pointed it out to Carl. "Let's see where it goes." The 2 men parked a mile from the marker and followed the trail on foot. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows. As they walked, the air grew colder, and the trail wound deeper into the scrubland until they came upon it, a clearing hidden away from the highway. In the center stood an old shed, its roof sagging, the wood weathered and splintered like bones. Carl drew his gun, signaling Roy to stay behind. They approached the shed cautiously, the air heavy with tension. Roy could hear his heart pounding in his ears as Carl pushed open the door. The smell hit them immediately. Rot, decay. Roy gagged, covering his nose as Carl shone his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated rusted engine parts, old truck batteries, and piles of personal belongings, wallets, boots, jackets, and something else. Something worse. In the corner, half buried under a tarp, were bones, human bones. Roy's blood ran cold as he spotted a familiar item. A leather wallet, the kind his friend Dale used to carry. Dale, who had disappeared 2 years ago, his rig found abandoned near mile marker 245. Carl cursed under his breath. "This isn't just a scam, Roy. They're killing people." Suddenly a noise outside made them freeze, a shuffling, followed by low whispers. Roy's heart raced as Carl motioned for him to stay quiet. They peered through a crack in the wall, seeing shadowy figures moving through the clearing, their faces hidden by hoods. Carl turned to Roy, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here, now." They crept away, low to the ground, slipping out the back of the shed as the figures circled closer. Roy's pulse pounded in his ears as they made their way back to the truck, every step feeling like an eternity. When they finally reached it, they sped off into the night, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Roy couldn't shake the horror of what they had found. This wasn't just a scam to rob truckers, it was a trap, designed to lure them in, strip their rigs, and leave them to die. And the figures that haunted mile marker 245, they were the ones doing the luring. Roy had seen enough to know he had stumbled onto something dark. Too dark. Truckers still talk about mile marker 245, the breakdowns, the whispers in the dark, the strange figures that seem to watch from the shadows. Most believe it's just a scam, a way for locals to make a quick buck. But Roy knows better. He's seen what's really out there, and now he has his own story to add to the legend, one that he shares with every trucker he meets, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he can keep someone else from becoming another lost soul, claimed by mile marker 245. Story 2. The desert sun was relentless, pressing down on the horizon as Jim's 18-wheeler rolled along the empty stretch of Arizona highway. He was running low on diesel, and the heat radiated off the blacktop, turning the world into a hazy blur. A weathered sign appeared in the distance. "Gas and go. 5 miles. Jim squinted at the fading letters and felt a tinge of relief. The sun was nearly setting, and he figured a quick stop to refuel was just what he needed. The gas station came into view, a lonely building in the middle of nowhere, a small oasis of fuel and snacks surrounded by a whole lot of nothing. Its faded sign swung gently in the hot wind, and the windows looked like they hadn't been washed in years. Jim pulled up to the pump, noting how strangely quiet the place was. No other cars, no hum of AC, not even the rustling of leaves in the dry brush. Just silence. Jim shrugged it off, chalking it up to the isolation. He parked and stepped out of his cab, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound that greeted him. He could feel a strange heaviness in the air, an odd sensation that seemed to hum just beneath the surface like static waiting to burst. He wandered over to the shop to pay for the gas, but the door resisted him, stuck until he threw his weight against it. The inside was dimly lit, the fluorescents buzzing overhead, some flickering like they were hanging on for dear life. There was no one behind the counter. A bell had chimed when Jim entered, but the place was deserted. A half-empty coffee pot sat on the counter, the liquid inside gone a murky brown. He waited, tapping his fingers against the counter. Tap, tap, tap. Nothing. The emptiness was beginning to feel more than strange. It was eerie, like he had stumbled into some place time had forgotten. Suddenly, a clock on the wall caught his eye. The second hand was twitching in place, moving back and forth in a barely noticeable rhythm. Jim frowned. He checked his watch. 8:15 p.m. He could have sworn it was earlier when he pulled in. Had he really been sitting there that long? He shook his head, a shiver creeping up his spine. Something was wrong. He hurried back to the pump, deciding he'd just fill up and get out of there. But when he stepped outside, the sun was gone. The stars had taken over the sky, twinkling coldly, and an unsettling feeling tightened in his chest. How long had he been inside? It felt like only a few minutes, maybe 10, but night had fallen completely. Jim glanced around, the silence now deafening. The fuel pump nozzle dangled limply from his truck, and his hands trembled as he shoved it back in place. The temperature had dropped drastically, and a sharp breeze swept through the lot. He turned, eyes scanning the flat expanse of the desert, but everything felt off. The horizon seemed to shimmer unnaturally, like heat waves, but colder, more distorted. Jim's instincts screamed at him to leave. He jumped into his truck and twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the headlights barely pierced the darkness. He drove out of the lot, his heart pounding in his ears, and as he hit the road, he felt the sensation of heaviness lift. In his rearview mirror, the gas station disappeared, not into the distance, but into nothing, as if it had never been there. Jim made it to the nearest truck stop an hour later, shaken and disoriented. The clerk inside eyed him warily, noting how pale he looked as Jim stammered about the gas and go. A few other truckers overheard him and exchanged glances. One of them, an older guy with sun-weathered skin, spoke up. "You say gas and go? Out near the old test sites?" Jim nodded, his throat dry. The older man leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "That place ain't supposed to exist anymore. Used to be a military testing ground back in the 50s. They shut it down. Radiation, underground bunkers, all sorts of unmarked hazards out there. Sometimes folks wander in, but they don't always come back the same, if they come back at all." Jim felt the weight settle in his stomach as the others nodded, their faces grim. You lose time out there, dude?" the man asked, and Jim swallowed hard, the realization washing over him. He had. Hours, maybe more. And as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the bustling truck stop, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him had stayed behind, trapped in the silent, eerie stillness of the Arizona gas and go. Jim wasn't the only one who had seen the gas and go. As word spread among the truckers, more stories began to emerge. A man named Carl, who sat at the corner of the truck stop diner, leaned forward, catching Jim's eye. His face was etched with deep lines, his eyes weary. He gestured for Jim to come over, and as Jim joined him, Carl started speaking in a low voice. "You're not the first, you know. That place, it shows up now and then, always catches someone new. Happened to me about 6 years back," Carl said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the diner. He looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Pulled in just like you. Needed fuel, a bite to eat. Only when I walked in, there were people there, kinda." Jim frowned. "People?" Carl nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but they weren't right. They were hollow, like they were just going through the motions." Guy behind the counter looked at me, but his eyes, they were empty. No light, no life, just staring. Carl shivered, rubbing his arms as if to ward off a chill. I tried talking to him, but he didn't respond. Just pointed at the clock on the wall. That's when I realized the second hand wasn't moving right, just twitching back and forth. Jim's heart pounded as Carl continued. "I got out of there fast. But when I drove off, I swear, I saw them all standing outside just watching me leave. Not moving, just staring." He paused, his eyes locking onto Jim's. "And when I looked in the mirror, the station was gone. Just like it was for you." Jim swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The two men sat in silence for a moment before another voice broke in. "I heard it used to be part of some MK Ultra experiment," a younger trucker chimed in from the next booth. He had been eavesdropping, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "You know, mind control, psychological warfare. They say the government messed with people's heads out there, left behind all sorts of equipment buried underground, radiation, chemicals, who knows what else. My uncle said they'd use places like that to test how people react to isolation, or how they handle time distortion." Jim's skin prickled. "Time distortion," he echoed, his voice barely a whisper. The younger trucker nodded. "Yeah, like making you lose hours, even days, without realizing it. They'd mess with the electromagnetic fields or something. People would just lose themselves, forget who they were, what they were doing. Some folks never snapped out of it. My uncle said that's why they shut it all down. Too many people went missing or came back. Wrong." Carl shook his head, his expression grim. "A lot of those places were supposed to be decommissioned, but you know how it goes. The desert's big, and not everything gets cleaned up. Some spots, they just get forgotten, until someone stumbles on them again." Jim shivered, the memory of the eerie silence, the unmoving clock, and the sudden nightfall replaying in his mind. He tried to push the thoughts away, but the feeling of something being left behind gnawed at him. He glanced at Carl, who gave him a knowing nod. "Listen," Carl said, his voice softer now. "If you ever find yourself out that way again, just keep driving. Don't stop, don't even look at it. Sometimes places like that, they're better left alone." Later that night, Jim tried to sleep in his truck, parked safely at the bustling stop. But his mind wouldn't rest. He kept thinking about the gas and go, about the strange emptiness and the way time had slipped away from him. He turned on his side, staring out the window at the darkened highway beyond. Shadows seemed to dance at the edge of his vision, flickering just out of sight. In the morning, Jim decided he needed answers. He couldn't just let it go. He asked around, talked to more truckers, and eventually found someone who claimed to know more, a woman named Marcy, who worked the night shift at a diner a few miles down the road. She was in her 50s, with graying hair tied back in a loose bun and a sharpness in her eyes that spoke of experience. "Gas and go," she repeated when Jim asked. She nodded slowly, her expression darkening. "Yeah, I know it. My brother went missing out there back in '82. He was military, stationed at one of those bases nearby. They said it was an accident, that he wandered off during a sandstorm, but I never believed it." Jim listened as Marcy leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He wrote me letters before he disappeared. Said they were doing things out there, things they shouldn't have been. Experiments with electromagnetic fields, messing with people's perception of reality. He mentioned a gas station once, said it would appear and disappear like it was never really there. I thought he was losing it, but then he vanished. Jim felt a chill settle deep in his bones. Do you think it's still out there? Marcy shrugged, her eyes glistening with a mix of anger and sadness.
I think whatever they did, it left a mark. Some places, they don't ever go back to normal. They just linger, waiting for the next poor soul to come along.
Jim left the diner with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't alone. Others had seen it, felt it, lost themselves in it. As he climbed back into his truck, he looked out at the desert, the vast emptiness stretching endlessly in every direction. He couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was watching, waiting, and that maybe, just maybe, the Arizona Gas and Go was still calling to him. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night lingered like a splinter in Jim's mind. Every time he took a haul through the Arizona desert, he felt an invisible pull, an urge to find that place again, as if some unfinished business gnawed at him. He started asking more truckers, listening to their stories, gathering scraps of information. One day, he met a man named Ray in another truck stop. Ray was quiet at first, but after a few beers, he opened up. His story mirrored Jim's, stopping at a station that wasn't supposed to exist, experiencing the strange silence and losing time. But Ray's experience had gone further. I went back, Ray confessed, his voice trembling slightly. I couldn't help it. I had to know, so I found it again. Only this time, I went looking underground. There's a hatch, hidden behind the station, covered in dirt and weeds. It leads down into some kind of bunker. Jim's breath caught. A bunker? Ray nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something darker. Yeah, I went down there. It was like stepping into another time. Old equipment, dusty papers, even bunk beds, like they were waiting for someone. But there were things that shouldn't have been there. Machines still humming, lights flickering, and the worst part... Ray paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. There were people, or what used to be people, just sitting there, in the dark, like they'd been waiting forever. Their eyes were open, but they weren't alive. Not really. They looked at me, but it was like they were looking through me. Jim felt his stomach turn. What did you do? I ran, Ray said simply. Got out of there as fast as I could, but something followed me. Not physically, but in here. He tapped his temple. I still hear them sometimes, whispering, calling me back. I think that place gets inside your head, and once it's in, it never really leaves. Jim stared at Ray, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. He knew Ray was right. The Gas and Go wasn't just a place, it was something more. Something that reached out, grabbing hold of those who stumbled across it, refusing to let them go. As Jim climbed back into his truck that night, he made a decision. He would never go back. No matter how strong the pull, no matter how deep his curiosity ran, he would keep driving. Some places were better left alone. Their secrets buried beneath the desert sands, forgotten but never truly gone. And as he drove away, the dark highway stretching endlessly ahead, Jim couldn't help but glance in the mirror.